a boy raised herding cattle and tutored by the elders of his Thembu tribe, Madiba would emerge as the last great liberator of the 20th century. Like Gandhi, he would lead a resistance movement, a movement that at its start had little prospect for success. Like Dr. King, he would give potent voice to the claims of the oppressed and the moral necessity of racial justice.
The Philadelphia Church of God presents the Trumpet Daily.
Hello everyone, welcome back to the Trumpet Daily. This week the world honored Nelson Mandela as one of the greatest heroes of our time. President Obama said that Mandela was the last great liberator of the 20th century. And in that speech he gave on Tuesday, he urged the world to carry on Mandela's legacy, as he called it, the legacy of fighting against inequality, poverty, discrimination. Lots of comparisons were made this week. One CNN reporter compared Mandela to Lincoln, saying that Mandela was the heir to Lincoln. In the president's speech, President Obama, he compared him to Lincoln, to Gandhi, and others, Dr. King. Wolf Blitzer said this on CNN: "Is it overly naive to hope and pray that maybe the death of Nelson Mandela will inspire some of those world leaders out there right now to do the right thing, to recognize that bloodshed and warfare is not going to achieve much, that peaceful relations perhaps can better be achieved through dialogue and discussion and hard work as opposed to war? Is it naive?" Well, the man he asked that of said it actually was naive. And yet all this praise, if we could just follow in the steps of this freedom fighter, as he's been called. And yet in the midst of all this effusive praise for a man that helped bring down the white government in South Africa in 1994, virtually nothing has been said about the nightmare in South Africa today, 20 years on from the end of apartheid, the crippling poverty that exists in the nation, the collapse of the educational system, the brutal attacks on white farmers all across the nation, the growing number of sexual assaults against little girls, the AIDS epidemic, and on it goes. That's the South Africa of today. And then, of course, there's Mandela himself. He's been repeatedly referred to as a freedom fighter, as I say, also a political prisoner, those years that he was in prison during apartheid. And yet, does anyone bother to look into why he was in prison in the first place? Why the authorities during that time kept him locked away? It's been said that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Does it matter that Mandela headed up this violent terrorist organization, the ANC, which was responsible and is responsible for many thousands of deaths, and much of it during the apartheid era was black-on-black crime? Is that a relevant piece of information that ought to be included in the story about what's happening today in South Africa, about Nelson Mandela? You probably have seen the reports of the sign language interpreter there at the ceremonies on Tuesday, who somehow got into the ceremonies without any credentials. He didn't know sign language. He was faking it, basically. He was a fake. And what an illustration that is of really this fake biography that's been written by Western officials about Nelson Mandela, a story that leaves out so much of the truth, a story that really tells quite a few lies. What about Mandela's ties to communism? Does that matter? Is that an important part of the story? The fact that he had strong communist leanings? Communism, I mean, if you look at the past 100 years, communism is responsible for more death and destruction than any other political movement. Does that matter? On Tuesday, much was made of President Obama's handshake with the Cuban dictator, Raul Castro. And his critics, Mr. Obama's critics, were saying, well, this reveals his leanings on the inside. And perhaps it does, but Castro's attendance at the ceremony also says a lot about Nelson Mandela. Why would Castro even show up at a ceremony such as that? Well, let me read to you what Mandela has said. This is Mandela in his own words from many years ago. He says, "Long live the Cuban Revolution. Long live Comrade Fidel Castro. Cuban internationalists have done so much for African independence, freedom, and justice." See, Nelson Mandela was a strong supporter of the regime in Cuba, and that's why Raul Castro showed up at the ceremony. Let me give you a couple of other tidbits from Mandela's history. He said, "If there is a country that has committed unspeakable atrocities in the world, it is the United States of America. They don't care for human beings." That's what Mandela said about the United States, and yet, as soon as he dies and the ceremony is arranged, you have all of these American statesmen just flocking to South Africa to show their support for this leader. Mandela also has said Yasser Arafat was one of the outstanding freedom fighters of this generation, one who gave his entire life to the cause of the Palestinian people. As I said earlier, a lot of comparisons have been made this week, saying Mandela's like George Washington or Abraham Lincoln or Martin Luther King or Gandhi. But really, a more accurate comparison would be to compare Mandela to Yasser Arafat, the former terrorist turned statesman that was enthusiastically embraced by the West. You had Yasser Arafat back in the mid-90s as well, showing up at the White House, shaking hands with foreign leaders and diplomats. President Clinton, the Israeli Prime Minister. And in much the same way, you have this former terrorist, not just accepted as a statesman, but now seen as one of the great liberators of our time. Let me read to you what it said in the American Thinker earlier this week, December the 11th. It said, "Nelson Mandela was a communist. Although most people think that is not important, it is the very essence of who he was. He never denounced communism. He never apologized for embracing communism. He never exposed the soul-destroying nature of communism. In this, Mandela was like Mugabe, the horrific Marxist leader of Zimbabwe, though he was not grossly evil like Mugabe." It says a little further down, "Communism is the worst faith ever to seize the hearts of men. The failure of decommunization after the fall of the Soviet Empire, the crushing of the student uprising at Tiananmen Square, and the overwhelming weight of evidence about the millions murdered by communists, 100 million is a conservative estimate these days, much worse than even the Holocaust, are the salient moral crimes of our time." It says finally, "Nelson Mandela may well be thought of as a good communist, and perhaps he is, but that is no better than calling Albert Speer a good Nazi. Both terms," it says, "are truly oxymorons." So he was a good communist, not quite as brutal as Mugabe or maybe his successors in South Africa today, but still, the movement that he led, the movement that he started, has it brought good tidings, peace, prosperity to the South African nation today? He hasn't disavowed his communist worldview, as that author there in The American Thinker pointed out. If anything, he wore it as a badge of honor. Here again is Mandela in his own words. Under a Communist Party government, South Africa will become a land of milk and honey. Political, economic, and social rights will cease to be enjoyed by whites only. They will be shared equally by whites and non-whites. There will be enough land and houses for all. There will be no unemployment, starvation, and disease. Workers will earn decent wages. Transport will be cheap and education free. These are the promises that he made as he set out to redistribute the wealth. And as it happens, the wealth among the few whites went over to a few blacks, and most of the nation is left to a poverty-stricken lifestyle. Look at all those promises that were made back at the end of apartheid. Isn't that an important angle to this story as well? If you look at his broken promises, if you look at his failed presidency, this is from the National Interest, December 10th, by R.W. Johnson. He writes, "What no one can take away is that Mandela showed extraordinary courage and fortitude through 28 years in jail, and he adopted a generous attitude of forgiving his enemies when he emerged from jail. These are the two great things that people all over the world remember," and that's what he's received so much praise for this past week. And not that that's something that shouldn't be done. It is a notable achievement, particularly in this world, when someone could be let out of jail and then not seek revenge on his jailers. He's also been praised because he voluntarily chose to step down 5 years or so after he became president. But besides these noteworthy achievements, as Johnson writes, people exhibit an extraordinary amnesia. I mean, they forget about everything else. They don't tell you the whole story. His presidential term started with the Shell House shootings, when ANC militants on the roof of the ANC's headquarters used AK-47s to gun down Inkatha marchers in the streets of Johannesburg. Mandela simply refused to hand over either the murderers or their weapons and attempted to justify this wholesale murder. Then, early in his term, the government laid off all the country's most experienced teachers, a blow from which the school system has never recovered. Mandela's administration also saw the passage of perhaps the most extreme labor laws in the world and radical affirmative action laws, which saw the ruination of the civil service by the mass replacement of skilled whites and Asians by mainly unskilled Africans. The civil service has also never recovered. This is his term as president. His administration also presided over a scandalous and extremely corrupt arms deal. We don't know whether Mandela profited personally from this. The presumption is that he didn't. Near the end of his administration, he gave probably the most extreme speech given by any South African president when he suggested that there was a vast conspiracy of opposition parties, NGOs, and criminal gangs, all trying to overthrow the government. The object of the speech, it says, quite transparently, was to lay out the rationale for highly repressive measures. And so he was in office just 5 years, and those highly repressive measures were left to his successors, who are much worse than Mandela was, for sure. And it's leaving some people today talking about the better times under apartheid, if you can imagine that. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, he spoke at the ceremony on Tuesday. This is from an article from a few months ago, earlier this year, Business Day Live. It says, Archbishop Tutu says South African society is now more violent than it was under apartheid. But he has faith that the younger generation has the ability to build a better society. He still thinks there's hope, even as South African society crumbles all around him. When asked what had happened to South African society, Mr. Tutu replied, "Very simply, we have become one of the most violent societies That is not what we were even under apartheid, but we are now. It's gotten a lot worse, he says. He said that every day the news reported murders and rapes, and even the high road death toll was a reflection of society. Finally, it says, Mr. Tutu said South African society had expected that once apartheid had been defeated, it would be more egalitarian, but statistics proved it was the most unequal in the world. As I said, if there's been a wealth transfer, it's just gone to a small group of blacks. And a lot of these other institutions, the educational institution, civil service, those things have just fallen apart because of this thuggish leadership coming from the ANC. Now, why won't the media report on these things? Look at the attacks, the brutal attacks on the white farmers in South Africa and their families. You just add up the numbers. If it's been about 3,000, some say 4,000 that have been killed since the end of apartheid. I mean, that amounts to 200 people per year just out on their farms, minding their own business, farming the land, and being robbed, raped, murdered. 200 white farmers a year. It's not even reported on internationally, and it's downplayed in South Africa even. They say, well, it's only 1,500 or 1,600. It's not 3,000. And it's hard to get an accurate counting because of the blind eye that's turned away from it, because of the reporting, the dishonest reporting that doesn't tell the whole story or that covers up the atrocities. Let me just read to you what Robert Morley wrote back in 2010 at thetrumpet.com. Since the end of apartheid, over 3,000 white farmers have been murdered, according to BBC. South Africa's News 24, on the other hand, says there have been only, he has in quotes, 1,600 farmers killed in approximately 10,000 farm attacks since 1991. 10,000. Even if that figure is true, it would still make farming in South Africa one of the most dangerous professions in the world. Can you imagine that? Farming in South Africa, one of the most dangerous professions in the world. He writes, white farmers are more than twice as likely to be killed as police officers and far more likely to be killed than miners. And if you read some of the reports within South Africa about these killings, some of them are the most brutal killings that you could imagine. Boiling infants in water, raping children, dragging white farmers behind a vehicle down a gravel road. And it's all done with the goal of terrorizing and eventually eliminating white farmers. Genocide. And this is something that, as Mr. Morley pointed out in that 2010 article, why it's sung about. It's popular lyrics among some of the top officials at the ANC. Kill the Boer and bring me my machine gun. That was the title that he used for that article. And it's a lyric out of a jingle that top politicians in South Africa like to sing. Let's look at Deuteronomy 28 here as we wrap this up. Deuteronomy 28. Many whites in South Africa are fleeing the nation. A lot more would if they could get visas and so on. But you can understand why. You can understand why many blacks would want to leave the nation as well. Deuteronomy 28 and verse 15, it says, "But it shall come to pass, if you will not hearken unto the voice of the Lord your God, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes, which I command you this day, that all these curses shall come upon you and overtake you." I mean, this is the blessings and cursings chapter. Leviticus 26 also discusses this. And as we've explained so many times before, the United States and Britain in Prophecy goes into this at length. God promised to Abraham to shower blessings and prosperity upon his descendants. And the people of the formerly great British Empire and the United States, we are those descendants of Israel. We are the recipients of these blessings that were promised way back in the book of Genesis. And that's why we had such fabulous prosperity and power for over 2-3 centuries. And yet, as is explained in Deuteronomy 28, the curses that set in for disobedience and rebellion, I mean, they're going to bring us down. Verse 43, it says, "The stranger that is within you shall get up above you very high, and you shall come down very low." See, flip-flop. "He shall lend to you, and you shall not lend to him. He shall be the head, and you shall be the tail." The strangers rise to the top. Things are turned upside down. And we've seen that happen in South Africa. It's just a small sampling of what's to come for more than 2 centuries. As I say, the English-speaking peoples, descendants of ancient Israel, have pretty much dominated the world because of these blessings that were promised to Abraham. And now that God's fulfilled his promises, those blessings are being taken away. That's what we're seeing. That's the significance, really. And we bring this out in the South Africa in Prophecy booklet. Mr. Ron Fraser, the late Ron Fraser, was writing about this back in 1994 and 1995 in the Trumpet. Even as apartheid was ending and as Mandela was coming into power, and then we put it into booklet form in 1997. Right about the mid part of the 20th century, we saw the blessings promised to Abraham's descendants. They were being taken away, and that's why world conditions have taken such a dramatic turn for the worse. And Mr. Fraser told us about this. Mr. Armstrong told us about this in the United States and Britain in Prophecy. My father's talked about it on the Key of David program. Look at Isaiah 59. We'll conclude over here. This is just prophecy. I mean, Moses didn't sit down and write Deuteronomy and think, oh, well, how can I be politically correct here? How can I make sure I don't offend anyone? He just told us what was going to happen. These peoples are going to be blessed because of Abraham's obedience. It's not because of a white thing. It's not because of America's ingenuity. It's because of the blessings that God promised. And God just simply said it. And he said that when those blessings are fulfilled, then I'll take them away if you sin, if you turn away from me, if you turn to rebellion. And that's what we're seeing happen right before our eyes. Isaiah 59 here. And verse 4, it just highlights how incapable man is of ruling man. Okay, so there's one minority or a majority in this case, that's oppressed. And then the tables turn and the oppressed becomes the leaders, and what do? They oppress. That's been man's legacy. That's been the history of human civilization. One of oppression and slavery. Every man doing what seems right in his own eyes. Isaiah 59, verse 4, it says, "None calls for justice, nor any pleads for truth. They trust in vanity and speak lies. They conceive mischief and bring forth iniquity." See, that's the world we live in today. I mean, we've tried every possible government known to man, and nothing's working. None of it's working. Communism, as I said, I mean, it's brought more death and destruction to human civilization in the last century than any other ideology. But look at the other governments that man has tried. Look at the United States. Look at where we're headed. Nothing's working, and so curses are setting in. And yet, how blind and ignorant do you have to be to search far and wide to try to find some kind of savior-like figure? I mean, we saw it with the elections here in the United States back in 2008. And then you hear all the comments about Mr. Mandela this past week. It's as if people are desperate for some kind of hope, some kind of salvation, and they'll turn anywhere in this world except to God. And they'll revise the history, they'll blot out certain events, whatever they need to do to find the Savior. Verse 7, their feet run to evil, and they make haste to shed innocent blood. Their thoughts are thoughts of iniquity. Wasting and destruction are in their paths. That's been the ways of man, just like it was in the days before the flood. You can see that in Genesis 6 and verse 5. What a violent society we live in. Imagine that, as that CNN commentator's talking about, well, can't world leaders look at the death of Mandela and understand how that if we just have more dialogue and less fighting? And even as he says that, look at what's happening in South Africa, the very nation where this man that he's holding up as a savior-like figure, it's just rotting from within. Verse 8 says, the way of peace they know not, and there's no judgment in their goings, and they've made them crooked paths. Whosoever goes therein shall not know peace. Look at how hard we work for peace. I mean, man is searching. He desperately wants to find a way. Communists think that communism is the way. Capitalists think that capitalism is the way. Socialists, socialism. And on it goes. Monarchies, dictatorships, tyranny. We look for a way, but the Bible says, even as we say peace, peace, and we talk about it, and we talk about it, and we talk about it, there is no peace. There's no peace in South Africa. It's an upside-down world. It's a violent world. It's a world that is just as the Bible described it would be in the days just before the return of Jesus Christ to this earth. I want to refer you to South Africa in Prophecy, written by the late Ron Fraser. It was published back in 1997. Let me just read to you what it says at the start of the booklet. Mr. Fraser says, since the handover of government to Nelson Mandela in May 1994, the euphoria which greeted the new president's inauguration has soured as crime runs rampant in the major cities. The country's health services unravel, educational standards adjust downward, and the rand plummets. The vision outlined by South Africa's new government included many promises in the areas of housing, welfare, education, and employment. These promises have yet to be largely fulfilled. What does the future hold for South Africa? This is what we wrote back in the mid-1990s. And what does the future hold? Well, what Mr. Fraser talks about and writes about in this booklet is exactly what we're seeing today. And as I say, in the larger sense, you can see that same point made in the United States and Britain in Prophecy. So make sure that you go to thetrumpet.com to get your free copy of this booklet, South Africa in Prophecy, and also the United States and Britain in Prophecy. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you again next time on the Trumpet Daily.